My hope with diving into this today is that people will listen and kind of maybe think about like, okay, well, maybe playlist pitching shouldn't be my number one priority because I think it gets kind of glamorized a lot and it's not as impactful as you probably think it is.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by IndiePRO.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 211. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is your co-host, Mr. Ed Isola. What is up, my friend? How's it going?
It's going well. The week's going well, and I'm excited to dive into today's topic. I think that it's something that a lot of people kind of view as the end-all, be-all, but that may not necessarily be the case starting off.
Leak the topic, my friend. Tell the listeners, what are we going to be talking about here today?
We are diving into all things playlisting. So different types of playlisting, best times to actually try to get playlisting, different techniques around that, and maybe some of the limitations as well into where it fits into your career and when it fits into your career.
This is something that we get a lot of questions about, where playlisting fits into a marketing strategy. We see a lot of artists who kind of put all of their eggs in the basket of playlisting and the challenges that can present. And it was probably a couple months ago that you and I talked about having this episode and talking about your experiences personally trying to run playlist campaigns for the 502s and going after listener user-generated playlists and trying to get your songs placed and kind of the efforts involved around that and the fruits or lack thereof of those efforts and what you saw with organic growth, what actually happened from a playlisting front when you started to see some more viral traction last year and into this year. And I think that would be something really cool to touch on here. It's kind of a little bit of a knockout round when it comes to relying on only playlisting for your growth.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you're right. This idea came about, I think, October, November, and it was directly centered around the 502s getting on some of these big editorial playlists on Spotify. And it was at that moment that I kind of realized like, wow, any effort or anything we had done, for the 3 years prior trying to get on these big playlists, what actually ended up getting us on it was nothing we could control. It was relationships and it was virality. And it was kind of like, I guess that was a revelation to me to kind of be like, wow, okay, so that was a waste of our time because no matter what our best efforts were not going to get us on these playlists. And then now looking forward, even though we're on them, it's not necessarily, it's awesome and I love it. It's cool, but it's like, it's not career making, right? It's not what people think it's going to be. So my hope with diving into this today is that people will listen and kind of maybe think about like, okay, well, maybe playlist pitching shouldn't be my number one priority because I think it gets kind of glamorized a lot and it's not as impactful as you probably think it is.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's kind of the goal of this episode, if there was one, is to just kind of demonstrate what you saw and give a little bit of an education on the different types of playlists. And maybe that's a good place to start. We talk about a lot of this inside of our Spotify field guide inside IndiePRO. So if you want to check that out, we'll leave a link to it in the show notes. But let's just give a rundown real quick, Ed, on the different kinds of playlists that exist within the Spotify ecosystem. Because a lot of artists don't know this. They kind of think that they all just live under one sort of type or one sort of roof. And that's not necessarily the case. There are actually three main types of playlists on Spotify. And you have Spotify editorial playlists, like you were saying, you have algorithm playlists, and you have user-generated playlists.
Yeah, exactly. So the editorial playlists are all those big playlists that you see that have, millions of followers or hundreds of thousands of followers, like Happy Folk, Hot Country, that kind of stuff. Those really, really big Spotify playlists, that's editorial stuff. And those are controlled by a team of kind of curators that add people to these playlists. So that's number one. The algorithmic stuff, those are automatically generated playlists for Spotify users that pull similar sounding artists to what they're already listening to and that kind of stuff. Pretty much based off of music listeners' habits, those playlists are created. The two main ones in there are Discover Weekly and Release Radar. Discover Weekly is a playlist that comes out every Monday, kind of based off your habits on Spotify. They pull together a handful of artists. I think it's like 30 songs or something like that, that are similar to what you're already listening to, kind of to help you discover new music. And then Release Radar is another playlist for each individual user that features any new releases from artists that they're fans of. So those are kind of editorials. And then you have algorithmic with those two little main subcategories. And then user playlists are exactly what they sound like. They're playlists created by users. So just, random normal people that make playlists, people then go and follow. So hopefully that kind of sets the playing field a little bit in terms of what the three actual playlists are. And I think that kind of naturally segues into which playlist people are trying to get onto.
Yeah, for sure. That was a great rundown. It's not hard to understand how these playlists work and what they do when you just learn about what they are. Like you said, Ed, Spotify's editorial playlist, your hot country or your happy folk or your indie teen party or whatever, these types of playlists are curated by Spotify's team. And the only way that you quote unquote pitch to those is by submitting through Spotify for Artists before you are actually releasing your song. So your song's unreleased, and that's when you go through the submission process. Algorithmic playlists, you don't do anything for those. They just occur naturally, and the engagement that your song has or your record has on the platform can have some benefit to how Release Radar and Discover Weekly are intertwined with your music. And then you have your user-generated playlists, where typically that's where playlist pitching is occurring, right? Whether it be through cold emailing, like actually doing research and finding the curators and reaching out to them. Artists have playlists as well, so that falls under user-generated playlist. When you make a playlist under your artist account, you have tools like Submit Hub that allow you to do submissions to these playlist curators as well. But those are all the user-generated types, and you can submit to those whenever you like, and there are tons and tons of services out there, and definitely some bad actors that I think a lot of artists get wrapped up in, especially early on as they're trying to learn about this. They get pulled into guaranteed placements and guaranteed streams or plays, which is really seedy and in most cases is fake, is not real. But those are the ways that you get traction on those three main types of playlists, or what people are doing to try and get their songs placed on them. So let's talk about you guys. When you started getting into going after playlisting, what were you working with? Were you working with going after user generated? Were you trying to focus and time the editorial playlist with your releases? What was going on?
Yeah. And real quick, as we dive into this, I just want to re-underline that in no way is this meant to be derogatory towards playlists or anything like that. It's not to say these streaming playlists aren't cool or they're not important, but I think what's really important to take away here is that they're not controllable. They're not controllable in terms of getting on them consistently or that being an actual way for you to grow day after day, which I think is kind of the core of everything we do at IndiePRO is actionable growth and fan generation. So that's kind of the lens through which we're approaching these playlists. So I just wanted to underline that this isn't us trashing playlists or whatever.
No, you're totally right. I mean, that's a great caveat. I feel the same way. This isn't to say that playlists don't have, and playlisting doesn't have its place. It's just not something that you should put all your eggs in that basket or focus all your effort and attention and energy on, when there are a lot of things you can be doing that can then influence what happens on the platform, which I think we're going to get into in a minute here.
Yes, exactly. But so starting off for us, early on, like everybody probably, it was kind of if we can get our song onto the Happy Folk playlist, and this is August 2017, right? If we can get our song, we're just starting, we think it's a good song. If we can get that song onto the Happy Folk playlist somehow, we'll be set and we'll be good to go, right? And that's a very pie in the sky thought process, but I think it's one that a lot of people have about if I can get my song onto X big playlist, that'll be great. So our approach towards doing that was really we spent hours researching, trying to find a contact, right? In hindsight, it was going to be a fruitless effort from the start, but we're if we could find this contact, they'll love the song, we can get on the playlist. And this is stuff we're doing in addition to direct marketing. So that was kind of approach one. And then on the same hand, looking at these user-generated playlists, just spending time going in, finding users and using some of those platforms that Jack had mentioned and submitting a song to playlisting. And again, the thought was if we can get on these playlists, or say we can get on 1,000 user-generated playlists, all of a sudden life's going to be really good. But the reality of the situation was that we maybe got added to 2 playlists. And this is where I think what we're trying to drive home throughout the episode is like, duh, of course we got added to 2 playlists. We're a band that just formed. Good song or not, we have 20 monthly listeners. There's no streams on the song. Playlists, what I found now looking back, our playlists want things that are already working. And probably hear that a lot in the music industry, but it's like
record labels want what's already working. Yeah.
They want what's working so that they can take your cool thing, put it on the playlist and be like, whoa, look, it's even more legitimate now because of us. They're interested in the story. So there was no story behind what we were doing, and not a story from in terms of a interesting narrative as a band, but there was no story behind traction with the songs or streaming numbers or anything like that. So number one, all that time and effort we spent researching, and this is like weeks of time, right? Like pitching, it ultimately led us to 0 really tangible positive results. I guess that's maybe, the wrap of opinion number 1.
So that was, it sounds like throughout like 2017, 2018, doing some testing with that, all the while doing direct response marketing and building your fan base and growing your customers. Where did you start to see recently the corner get turned a bit? What were you seeing there? What was happening? Was it when you took your foot off the gas of doing this and kind of just like said, I'm not going to worry about it, like not going to put any eggs in this basket?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting, right? So like 2017, we're pitching, there's very little success. And those 2 playlists were like, 2 user-generated playlists with maybe a total of like 500 listeners on them. So there wasn't like anything super significant. So then after that, I was just kind of like, well, this was pointless. This was a waste of time. And we were running fan finder traffic at the same time and like seeing beneficial stuff there. It's like, I'm just going to focus on that. And at least we could see results from that. So we kind of stopped. I mean, we stopped doing any kind of playlist pitching from 2017 all the way through 2021, like last year at the end of the year. And for that, the thought process was like, hey, let's pair, at this point, we're a slightly bigger band. We've got 50,000 monthly listeners, maybe just kind of accumulated over the last 4 years, give or take. And it was like, at this point, we think that we've got songs with 500,000 streams on them. Again, we think if we could get onto one of these playlists, that would really help kind of grow our career. And at that point, we had a viral song on TikTok in Magdalene a year before in November of 2020 that had a couple million streams on it. So we're like, oh, we're actually like probably a good candidate to be on these playlists. So going into our album release in October of 2021, last October, our point of view was we have this song that has a couple million streams. We have this awesome album. It's a great album. That's coming out in October. We should pair with a distributor who has direct access to these playlists, and we should try to see if they can get us on the playlist. Can they get Magdalene on there? It already has a bunch of social proof. Can they get one of our singles on there? And over the course of, essentially, we started rolling out singles for this album in last March, and we rolled one out from like March all the way through October. So it was like 5, 6, or 7 singles, something like that. And we were working with distributors, and nothing came of it, right? Like, I feel like the picture I'm trying to paint is that as a band, I felt that we were in a spot that, it's a slam dunk for us to be on these playlists. Millions of streams at this point on one song, all the stuff I just listed, and there was no traction on playlists at all.
So even with the connections at this point that you thought would get you in the door a bit more, potentially, nothing, crickets.
Right, exactly. Even with the connections who had direct access to Spotify reps, there was nothing. And the sentiment again was like, in so many words, well, like there's no real story, right? Like it's nice that there was a song with 3 million streams from TikTok, but like that's not exciting anybody. So there was all this great stuff that we thought, and there was a lot of great stuff going on in our ecosystem in terms of our email list and the shows going well and all this stuff. It meant nothing to the playlisting. And that was just further evidence of like, well, okay, the playlisting is uncontrollable, and that's totally out of our wheelhouse in terms of being able to make it happen, even with connections.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So that's interesting. I mean, it must have been somewhat discouraging, even though at the time, I know you guys kind of like put a blind eye to the discouraging things and just charge forward into the stuff that is working. And I think that that's worth mentioning here because all the while, like you guys didn't have your eggs all in the playlisting basket. So it wasn't like you were following the literal definition of insanity of trying to crack this code for years. It was just like something off to the side you were doing at this point while you were growing, sort of this groundswell of 502's audience and fan base. What happened next as things started to turn, the corner into seeing some playlist placement?
Yeah. And I think that's really a good point that you just outlined is like, had this playlisting effort been our sole goal and approach at making this album work and attracting us new fans, it would have been a very, very big failure. And, maybe the band's not around anymore.
Yeah, that's crazy. The implications of that are nuts to think about.
Yeah, exactly. Like we were doing this pitching, but we were also doing an album launch opt-in and sales offers and shows and running ads to like Spotify to build our ecosystem by ourselves. And so the playlisting was one of 5 or 6 different approaches we were taking. But yeah, if it had been the sole thing, it would have not have gone well. And that's a reason that we would have probably broken up, to be honest. Like it would have just been very discouraging to be like, well, this whole great album, what have we been doing for the last 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of what we were getting at with making this episode. Is like we don't want people to put themselves in a place where all of a sudden, like relying on this for so long, even if you do have a triggering moment of success with it, relying on it continuously over too long of a period of time can kind of spell disaster for your artistic career, whether you run out of money or, you run out of time or whatever, or you run out of content or music, like eventually it's going to spell some kind of disaster.
Yeah, for sure. I would call this Spotify playlisting the home run swing, So I think that what we were doing was like, we were doing the singles and the doubles of like, oh, look, we added 4,000 or 5,000 people to our email list. Like this kind of stuff that as a business is super, super valuable. We were continuing to do that and grow our ecosystem while also being like, oh, playlist could be cool, right? That could put it over the top. So anyways, the real turning point and where I kind of then this idea for this podcast came from, and I think it's important to outline is like, we have a viral song on TikTok in just a little while. It goes crazy. There's like over 150,000 user generated videos on TikTok between the two sounds. It's up to almost 25 million streams now. This song goes insane. And that was finally the level at which I emailed our distribution reps and we're like, hey, this is bonkers. Like, can we get some playlists now? And they went and they pitched it and they had the whole story. And then we finally got on playlists. So it wasn't until, even people with the connections, it wasn't until there was this huge viral moment that we were getting on editorial playlists and that kind of stuff. And the user generated playlist followed very naturally after that. So I hope that isn't a discouraging comment, but it's kind of like, that's how much it took for us to achieve in order to get on these playlists. Like it was crazy.
Definitely. Yeah. What did you guys actually end up landing, if you remember off the top of your head?
Yeah. I mean, as soon as we got on the editorial playlist, they all came, like when it rains, it pours. It was like, there was a good vibes playlist, a dopamine playlist, happy folk, alternative, totally stress-free.
Happy folk, the one you wanted to get on from the beginning.
Right. And like we did, and one of my bandmates called and was like, dude, we've been trying to get on happy folk for the last 5 years. Like we finally did it. And in my head, I was like, 1, that's crazy. That's awesome. 2, I was like, this is totally, it's the byproduct of 5 years of consistency. It was not because of one thing or the other. So
that's so good.
It's kind of just, I think, worth continuing to mention. This was the home run swing and something out of our control in terms of like a viral moment happened. We were aware enough of what playlisting was to spin that into playlist for ourselves. But had that never happened, we would have never got the playlists. And it just comes back to my point that if you remove the playlists, we still were growing, right? Like we still were getting a huge chunk of streams daily by our own ads and our own efforts. Like our Spotify had been growing through the Reels campaigns and stuff like that. Email list was growing. We were running opt-ins. We were posting organically. We were still doing stuff. This just kind of put fire on the already slow burning build.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that makes a ton of sense. And obviously, like I got to watch it play out, which was cool. I think you underlined it pretty well in saying that getting on those editorial playlists where you can't pitch to them through like a service, and it doesn't work like user generated playlist, and trying to time it so that your releases fall perfectly and somehow orchestrate a viral moment within a very short period of time just is not like, it's just not the way to approach it just for the sake of the playlist. Like what you're saying is when you get the windfall, that's when the windfall, meaning like the explosive kind of growth that you guys saw, that's when these things will start to click and come together.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the beautiful thing about it is that what you just said and what I agree with is like getting on playlists is like a lever. When and if things pop off like to a crazy level, then you pull the lever and be like, okay, now we can go try to get playlists. It's not the first thing you do. And I think what's encouraging about that is that it all comes back to, and go back and listen a couple episodes back, it comes back to the content. Like what ultimately drove this string of success for us was great video content. And it all started with a great fan finder video chopped up into a TikTok video with a great sound that, a great clip that kind of went viral. And then people heard that and they took the trend to themselves. So, we didn't start the trend for them. And I think what's encouraging about all that is that great fan finder leads to engagement, leads to TikToks, leads to playlists, is that just a little while had already been out for 3 months, right? So it's an old song.
That's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't like we released the song, dropped the video, it went viral the day it came out. And then around this release, it was like going crazy. Just a little while, the single actually came out in, I think, July and then December. So it actually had been out for 6 months. And so what's encouraging, I think, is that success is not limited to new content. Not saying you need to go back and backtrack, but
dude, say that louder for the people in the back, for sure.
It's not limited to your new content. You can make great videos for existing content and roll that out. And if it catches on, it catches on. But the strategy is not, if it catches on, we get playlists. It's like, if it catches on, now we have huge top of funnel awareness. We can go get emails. That was our thought process. And we were just, like I said, aware enough to say, oh, we could also now spin this into playlisting.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's funny. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with an indie who specifically had done a lot of playlist work and also had a lot of algorithmic success on Spotify, and that had come through organic growth elsewhere. But a lot of playlist popping off that had occurred for him created this fan base, or this listener base, I'll call it, that he couldn't reach. So that's a problem that you guys don't really have, or you're not as concerned with, because the playlist audience that came from this growth isn't the only thing that you're working with as far as like monetization goes, which I think is really important to note here, is that like if you're starting off with playlisting as your strategy, understand, just as a consequence of that you are going to have a harder time connecting with those fans, reaching those fans, engaging those fans, or even really turning them into fans because of the lack of return path on Spotify, because of the data kind of black hole that it is. That's a real challenge. And you guys positioning yourselves the way that you did with what was going on in your marketing put you in a place where you didn't have to be so concerned about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, because like, had this happened any earlier, I think we would have been in trouble in terms of longevity. I think that what we had and what we had become really, really good at was all of the core principles of the buddy system. So then that was all in place. We had an opt-in offer. We knew how to nurture. We were posting consistently on our socials. We were making sales offers. So when it went viral, we immediately were just like, oh, all these people are streaming? Let me just drop a canvas on the background of Spotify, telling them to text in, and then give them free stuff. Like, we knew how to kind of leverage it, which was great. So I think that just kind of hopefully underlines, like, you got to keep building your buddy system so that when this big opportunity does come around, you're ready for it. Otherwise, it's gonna kind of just be a flash in the pan and be like, okay, look, if this comes around, I'm sure there's examples on TikTok and stuff of people who have gone mega viral. And I can think of a couple that, I won't name, but have gone mega viral and then had nothing else, right? Like, their music was not out. When we were talking to record labels and stuff like that early on, like in this virality moment, a lot of the conversation centered around, wow, you guys know your stuff. You know what you're talking about. And you know your business. And that's actually really exciting to us, because you're not an artist that we're going to have to come into and one, teach music business to, two, help get organized and like get some form of content production going, and then three, try to make bigger opportunities appear for. Not that that's the key, but like there's a huge benefit for yourself of knowing like, hey, I know my business and now this top of funnel is happening. I can slot people into it versus it happens, you don't know what to do, and then you have to sign away 50, 60% to a record label who's going to help develop you because you're just not there yet. And then it's like, well, what was the point of that anyways? You're going to make pennies on the dollar. Yeah, dude, for sure. Like that is, I think, such a key thing, regardless, whether we're talking about playlisting, whether we're talking about viral organic growth, whether we're talking about viral paid traffic growth, whatever it might be, that ability to be agile and build the infrastructure, either have the infrastructure or be able to build it really quickly to capitalize is so important. And we've seen that time and time again. I've seen that with so many different artists. I think back to like 2018 when one of our IndieX clients, friends of ours in the Small Town Titans, they went viral with their You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch video around Christmas time. And they immediately pivoted into, okay, we've got this massive audience that's streaming in, like, let's get them captured. And they built a funnel to create an opportunity for people to sign up and turn people into customers. And they generated a big customer list and a lot of revenue really fast because they were able to be like, snap, I'm going to make it happen. We see the opportunity in front of us. But if they were only thinking about the viral moment, this is exactly what you're talking about, just in a different context. If they were only able to see the viral moment and that was it, then they wouldn't be where they are today. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that they're a great example of capitalizing on it using a funnel. And that was really smart on their end. And then they've done a really good job of building that out into an ecosystem of fans where they can talk and communicate and stuff like that. I think maybe the last thing that I'm thinking about that I want to mention about thinking of big playlist as the end all be all, hey, this is how I'm going to get relevant, is that the downside to these big playlists I've seen is that when you get on them, you'll see streams go up, you'll see your listeners go up. But what happens is that your save rates go dramatically down to like 1-2% on those playlists, because what people are doing is they're playing these things and they're letting them play in the background. So getting on these huge editorial playlists isn't always a gold covered path to immediate fans because they're not actively listening. So that's something else to keep in mind, is that it's not going to be an active listener platform. So anyways, that's just something I'm thinking that's like one of the things I never considered. And then once it happens, it's like, oh, well, okay, this is cool because our numbers are getting much bigger and like the payouts are getting bigger. But in terms of actual fan creation, it's not driving as much as our content or our emails or anything like that.
I think that's kind of another check in the box for like building the growth for yourself without relying on the playlist, and then letting any playlisting that happens as a result be a consequence of that organic growth that you've been doing, or paid traffic. When I say organic growth, I just mean audience growth in this scenario without playlisting as its engine. And I think that's a really great point. Not only is the front end affected, but the back end is affected, and how you take those listeners from then being cold to being warmer and to being actual fans is a different, more challenging kind of uphill process, like we were saying. So yeah, that's such a good point to kind of end off on here.
Yeah. So, moral of the story is like playlisting should be the icing on the cake, not the main ingredient, I guess is a good way to put it. So keep doing your thing, keep building your buddy system out, and let playlisting come when it does.
I don't think I could say it better myself. That's such a good way to wrap it up and kind of succinctly get across the point that we're trying to get here. I hope you guys dug this and it answered some questions about playlisting, about the different types of playlists on Spotify, how you can approach them, and how you should be careful to not approach them and not approach your music marketing in general. This was so much fun. Thanks, dude.
Same to you. Talk to you all soon.
Peace out, Indies.